Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to really plunge into some complex topics, looking at compelling ideas, cutting-edge research, just trying to give you a truly informed perspective. And today, we're tackling something that touches every single one of us. This profound, really persistent paradox of human inequality. I mean, think about it. Most societies throughout history, they claim to value fairness, equal opportunity. Yet almost universally, you see these rigid structures. Structures where, well, a hardworking majority finds its access to fundamental resources somehow systematically constrained. So our mission today, to understand the engine behind this social stratification. We're approaching it not just as, a collection of individual wins and losses, but as an emergent property. Something arising from a deeply entrenched, very complex system. And here what's really groundbreaking about the sources we're drawing on today. We've got this unique dual lens approach. First, we'll explore some really cutting-edge research using wearable biosensors, basically measuring the subtle physiological toll inequality takes on us as individuals. It's almost like turning your own body into a sensor for social pressure. And second, we're going to delve into a powerful historical and sociological analysis, looking at the macro-level architecture of control, everything from, the brutal realities of ancient slavery, right up to its subtle modern forms embedded in global capitalism today.
Exactly. And this deep dive, we're adopting what the sources call an AI perspective. Now, that doesn't mean robots taking over. It means we're looking at society as a complex adaptive system. We're using data-driven analysis, including this really novel biometric data, to spot patterns, and then using computational modeling, trying to understand how inequality actually self-perpetuates. The idea is to move beyond just ideology, get to a more mechanistic, evidence-based explanation. And when we talk about the average human here, we're not talking about some romantic ideal. We mean the functional majority, the people who form the bedrock of any society, farmers, teachers, nurses, all the service providers, their labor, their cooperation, it's essential for stability, for productivity.
Yeah.
So the core question isn't really, why do some individuals fail? It's more like, why does the system itself seem almost designed to limit the potential and well-being of this absolutely essential majority?
Right. So, okay, if we're going to understand this engine of inequality, we have to start by looking at its most immediate impact, right, on us, on our bodies. This first lens, this science of wearable feelings, it offers a truly groundbreaking way into this micro-level toll. So what exactly are these wearables picking up on?
Well, they're essentially translating our subjective emotional experiences, things we feel, into objective, quantifiable data streams. You can imagine these new generation wearable biosensors, something like the Emotibit module, capturing your body's most honest signals, things directly linked to your autonomic nervous system. So for instance, there's electrodermal activity, EDD. That measures tiny changes in your skin's electrical properties, basically from sweat gland activity. It's a very sensitive, almost instantaneous indicator of emotional or physiological arousal. It reacts within seconds to something like fear or surprise. It's almost like a silent cry from your system, much less consciously controllable than, say, a facial expression or the tone of your voice. Then you've got photoplethysmography, PPG. That's an optical technique, measures changes in blood volume, usually at your fingertip or wrist. And from that, we get heart rate, obviously, but also crucially, heart rate variability, or HRV. Now, high HRV, that signals a healthy, adaptable nervous system. Think of it as your body's ability to kind of roll with the punches, recover quickly from stress. Low HRV, though, that's a bit of a red flag. It suggests chronic stress, a nervous system that's perpetually on high alert. And that, over time, can lead to pretty serious health problems. We also track skin temperature. Changes there, especially in your fingertips, are linked to autonomic nervous system activity. It can even help differentiate between pleasant and unpleasant emotional states. And looking ahead, there's a lot of work on sweat biomarkers. The potential there is to non-invasively measure stress hormones like cortisol, giving us a direct chemical signature of stress levels.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So, continuously capturing all these subtle signals, what are the real-world implications? What does it actually tell us?
Well, it means this wearable feelings technology can create this incredibly high-fidelity longitudinal record of an individual's physiological state. Imagine the stress of a really precarious job, or the constant anxiety of financial insecurity, or maybe the physiological calm you feel in a truly supportive community. All of that, captured and quantified, it gives us an objective, data-driven way to validate and measure the lived, embodied experience of inequality. It really moves the conversation, from just abstract political debate to something measurable. physiological impact. And this leads us straight into the concept of allostatic load.
Yeah.
This is basically the higher cumulative burden of chronic stress that individuals in lower socioeconomic strata consistently face. Think financial instability, food insecurity, discrimination, maybe limited healthcare access. All these things trigger persistent activation of the body's stress response systems. So when you correlate this biometric data like consistently elevated EDA or suppressed HRV with someone's socioeconomic status over time, well, you get this powerful objective evidence of the body's struggle. And here's the critical insight, the really big idea from the sources. A sustained high-stress biometric profile seen over months or years effectively becomes a biomarker for social injustice. It radically reframes the whole problem, doesn't it? Social inequality isn't just an economic issue or an ethical one, it's a public health crisis, and it's measurable right down to individual physiology. And this gives us a potent new tool for what the sources call social diagnostics. Theoretically, policymakers could use this to assess the real-world physiological impact of their policies almost in real time. Imagine tracking the collective change in, say, cortisol levels or daily stress patterns after a new tax policy gets implemented.
A biomarker for social injustice. That's a truly profound idea. But I have to ask, isn't there a risk here? A risk of oversimplifying these incredibly complex social issues down to just physiological readings and ethically? I mean, how do we make sure such powerful diagnostic tools aren't misused, for surveillance or control by people in power?
Those are absolutely crucial questions, and the research is quite clear on this. These biometric markers, they provide evidence of impact. They aren't the complete explanation for complex social problems. They're diagnostic tools meant to highlight disparities, show the human cost. And yes, the ethical implications of gathering such intimate data are enormous, paramount. The report really stresses that this technology, while it's potentially powerful for identifying social injustice, must be developed and deployed with really strict ethical guidelines. The focus has to be on public good, and it needs to be regulated against manipulative advertising or social scoring or any kind of invasive surveillance. It's about empowerment, not control.
Okay, understood. That's reassuring. Now, taking this a step further, how does this constant measurable stress, this allostatic load, actually impact our brains, our ability to navigate the world? Let's unpack the brain's regulatory system a bit.
Right. So emotion regulation, it's your brain's really complex capacity to influence which emotions you feel, when you feel them, and how you experience and express them. It's absolutely fundamental to mental well-being, to how we function socially. Inside your brain, you've got this dynamic interplay going on. The amygdala, that's like your brain's emotional alarm system. It triggers immediate responses like fear. Then you have the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. That's the executive control center. The more rational part that modulates the amygdala's impulses, integrating emotional information with, rational thought. This dialogue between them allows for conscious, deliberate regulation of feelings. Now, what's particularly compelling and frankly concerning is how chronic stress, trauma, adversity, the very conditions that disproportionately affect people in lower social strata, can severely impair this whole system. When your brain is constantly flooded with stress hormones like cortisol, the part responsible for calm, rational decision-making, your PFC, can actually weaken over time. Its connections can degrade. And at the same time, your brain's alarm center, the amygdala, can become hypersensitive, leading to the state of chronic hypervigilance. The end result is what researchers call a dysregulated state. You see heightened emotional reactivity, poor impulse control, real difficulty with long-term planning, and just trouble managing negative emotions effectively. And it's crucial to understand this isn't some kind of moral failing. The sources frame it as a physiological injury inflicted by a hostile or overly stressful environment.
An injury. It's really astonishing to think of it that way. So how does this state, this sort of neurologically handicapped condition, how does that influence someone's actual behavior, their decisions in daily life?
Yeah, it has predictable behavioral outcomes. The field of neuroeconomics explores this. If you're faced with a decision and you have a weakened PFC and a hyperreactive amygdala, you're much more likely to be driven by immediate needs and fears. That's the amygdala shouting rather than focusing on long-term goals, which is the PFC's job. So you'll likely exhibit higher loss aversion, a stronger preference for immediate gratification. This can lead to decisions in finance, health, education that might look suboptimal in the long run. But again, these aren't bad choices in a moral sense. They're arguably the rational choices for a brain that's been wired for short-term survival in what it perceives as a threatening environment. And if we step back, zoom out again, you can see how the very architecture of social stratification creates this really damaging feedback loop. It gets inscribed directly onto the neurology of the people within it. Being born into a low SES environment often means greater exposure to chronic stressors. That creates chronic physiological stress, the stuff we can measure with wearable feelings. This stress then neurologically impairs the PFC, compromising abilities like emotion regulation and long-term planning. And this neurologically handicapped state, as the sources term it, predisposes individuals to behaviors that, statistically speaking, make it harder to accumulate resources and escape that low SES environment. It reinforces their position in the hierarchy. This really poses a fundamental challenge to the whole idea of pure meritocracy, doesn't it? Because the system itself can actually damage the biological hardware you need to succeed, regardless of effort.
We've just explored this deep physiological cost of inequality, right down to how it seems to reshape our brains. Okay, now let's zoom out completely. Let's examine the societal machine that perpetuates all this. How do these rigid structures of control even come about?
Well, history shows us pretty clearly that systemic stratification is nothing new, not by a long shot. We can look way back to ancient systems like chattel slavery. I mean, that's the most extreme form of human control, where people were legally defined, bought, sold, just like property. Think about the Roman Empire. Enslaved individuals were the absolute bedrock of their economy. Their forced labor sustained huge agricultural estates, mines, and this brutal system, it led to the annihilation of entire populations in some cases, like the indigenous Taino people under Spanish colonization, just devastating. Then later, in medieval Europe, you see this gradual transition towards serfdom. Peasants were legally tied to the land they worked. They weren't owned as property like in chattel slavery, but their rights were severely restricted. They had to work the Lord's fields, pay fees for things like marriage, especially if they wanted to marry someone outside the Lord's domain. And importantly, these systems weren't just held in place by force. There were always ideological justifications. Feudal society, for example, used the estates of the realm model, clergy pray, nobility fight, peasants work. This presented the rigid hierarchy not as exploitation, but as a natural, even divinely ordained order. It socialized people to accept their station. And this use of ideology to legitimize inequality, that's a theme we see recurring throughout history right up to today.
Right, so those were very overt systems, blatant control. But in our contemporary societies, it feels, well, more complex. We've largely moved past overt slavery and serfdom, at least officially, yet inequality is still incredibly persistent. What does stratification look like now?
Yeah, today we generally talk about social stratification. Sociologists define it as society's hierarchical categorization of people. It's based on a whole bunch of factors: wealth, income, education, occupation, power, race, ethnicity, gender. All these things contribute to an individual's socioeconomic status, their SES. And we usually distinguish between closed systems like historical caste systems in India, where there's virtually no social mobility, your status is fixed at birth, and open systems like the class systems in most modern Western societies. These are theoretically based on achievement, allowing for some movement up or down. However, and this is a big however, even in these supposedly open systems, when you look at the overall social patterns, people from similar backgrounds tend to end up sharing the same level of stratification. This strongly indicates that the system itself is perpetuating inequality, even while it often masks this reality with the belief in pure meritocracy. Anyone can make it if they just try hard enough. And the drivers of modern economic inequality are really powerful and interconnected. You've got globalization and technological change, right? Jobs moving to cheaper labor markets, automation replacing certain kinds of work. This widens the gap between a less educated and highly educated workforces. Then there's policy and taxation. They play a huge role. Tax policies that disproportionately benefit the wealthy, for example. Stagnation of real wages for the majority, while you see executive compensation just soaring. And we absolutely cannot ignore systemic bias and historical legacies, things like the persistent wage gaps for women and people of color. These are often direct results of historical injustices, slavery, segregation laws that systematically prevented wealth building across generations for entire communities.
It is striking how even in these supposedly open systems, inequality just persists. But some people still argue, quite strongly, that individual effort remains the primary factor. How does this idea of systemic perpetuation really address that common belief? And maybe even more disturbingly, for all our talk about progress, have the most extreme forms of exploitation like slavery truly been eradicated?
Well, that common belief in pure individual effort is precisely what the system's perpetuation often relies on. It's part of the ideology. But the evidence, especially when you combine the historical analysis with data like the wearable feelings research, strongly suggests that the system itself creates significant barriers and disadvantages. It makes it statistically much harder for many people to succeed, regardless of how much individual effort they put in. And to your second very important question, no. Tragically, the most extreme forms of exploitation have absolutely not been eradicated. We call it modern slavery now. It includes things like forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, human trafficking. The statistics are just astonishing and deeply sobering. According to the sources, in 2021, an estimated 50 million people were living in conditions of modern slavery. That's a staggering 10 million increase since 2016. And this is a global crisis. It happens in every country, regardless of wealth. In fact, more than half of forced labor and about a quarter of forced marriages are found in upper middle or even high-income countries. The most vulnerable groups are disproportionately women, children, and migrants. These hidden chains, they represent the brutal, coercive foundation that's still present, underpinning the contemporary stratification engine.
Okay, so at the very heart of all this social stratification, we keep coming back to the concept of power. How exactly is power defined in sociological terms? And how does it actually operate to create and sustain these hierarchies we're seeing?
Right. Sociologically speaking, power is fundamentally the ability of an individual or a group to influence or control the behavior of others. Even when those others resist, it's a dynamic thing, a relational force. And it shows up in different forms. There's coercive power, which is based on force or threats. There's legitimate power or authority, which comes from social norms, laws, institutions people accepted as right. Then you have expert power, which comes from having specialized knowledge or skills, and referent power, which is based on charisma, reputation, people wanting to be like you. And some foundational thinkers in sociology have given us really powerful lenses to understand how power operates. Karl Marx, for instance, saw power as fundamentally rooted in the economic structure. Control over the means of production, he argued, gives the bourgeoisie ultimate power over the proletariat, the workers. Max Weber offered a more multifaceted view. He agreed economics was key, class, but added social status or honor and political power, party, as distinct dimensions. He also importantly distinguished between power as sheer coercion and legitimate authority. Power people obey because they believe it's right, whether traditional, charismatic, or rational, legal. And then Michel Foucault had a very different take. He saw power as much more diffuse, pervasive, embedded in all social practices, institutions, even in language and knowledge itself. For Foucault, power isn't just repressive, saying no, it's also productive. It creates categories, defines what's normal, and encourages us to discipline ourselves. Think of his famous panopticon model of surveillance. We behave because we feel we might be watched, so we self-regulate.
Okay, if Foucault suggests power is so diffuse, and you mentioned Gramsci earlier arguing for this hegemony, where people kind of consent to their own subordination, does that mean real systemic change is almost impossible? Because the system itself suppresses even the desire for change.
That's a really critical question, and it gets to the heart of why these systems are so stable. Gramsci's concept of hegemony is key here. He argued that a ruling class maintains its power not primarily through brute force, though that's always in the background, but through cultural and ideological leadership. By controlling institutions like education, media, religion, the dominant group spreads a worldview, a set of values and beliefs that presents its own interests as the common sense interests of the whole society. This ideology can become so deeply ingrained that the existing social arrangements, the inequality, start to seem natural, inevitable, maybe even desirable, even to the people who are disadvantaged by them. This explains that powerful phenomenon of socialized acceptance, why people often accept their place. So Gramsci would say change is incredibly difficult, yes, but he also emphasized that hegemony is never total or permanent. There are always contradictions, always spaces for counter-hegemonic struggles, cracks where resistance can form and challenge that dominant worldview. Stepping back again, if we look at the contemporary global stratification engine, it's really a sophisticated and resilient hybrid engine, as the sources describe it. It operates using all these forms of power, coercive, economic, legitimate, ideological, simultaneously and synergistically. They reinforce each other. Think of it like a set of reinforcing feedback loops. Concentrated economic power is used to gain political influence. That's Weber's party. Political influence then shapes laws, regulations, tax policies that further concentrate wealth. That's Weber's legitimate power. This combined economic and political power then exerts huge control over major cultural institutions, mass media, education systems. These institutions produce and disseminate narratives that justify inequality, often framing it as the natural outcome of merit and hard work. That creates ideological hegemony, Gramsci's idea. And this cultural programming shapes our beliefs, our values, our desires. It leads individuals to internalize the norms of the system and self-regulate their behavior accordingly. That's Foucault's disciplinary power. This integrated model really shows why the system is so remarkably stable and resistant to change. If you tried to dismantle the engine by targeting only one power source, say, only pushing for wealth redistribution without tackling political influence or the cultural narratives, it's likely to fail. The other parts of the system will push back or compensate. So a truly effective strategy to mitigate inequality has to be multi-pronged. It needs to target the economic, the political, and the cultural ideological dimensions in a coordinated way. And what's really compelling here, again, is how these abstract theoretical dimensions of power connect directly back to our individual experience, the stuff captured by wearable feelings. Coercive power, that manifests as chronic stress, a physiological threat response, economic powerlessness. That leads to anxiety, feelings of insecurity, legitimate power, like dealing with bureaucracy, maybe feelings of alienation or frustration. Ideological power, that can lead to internalized feelings of inadequacy or intense political polarization.
That connection is really powerful. It makes so much sense. Okay, now for another fascinating layer to this whole thing. Is hierarchy just a cultural invention? Or is there something deeper, maybe an evolutionary imperative for human groups to organize themselves this way?
That's a great question. The tendency for human groups to form hierarchies is incredibly widespread, seen across so many species. This strongly suggests it has deep evolutionary roots, an innate basis. From an evolutionary perspective, hierarchies likely evolved as a way to manage conflict within groups and efficiently allocate limited resources, things like food, territory, mating opportunities, things that directly impact survival and reproductive success. And evolutionary psychology offers a useful framework here, suggesting humans navigate these hierarchies using what's called dual strategies theory. Basically, humans seem to have evolved two primary pathways to gain status and influence within a group. First, there's the dominance strategy. This is evolutionarily older, something we share with many primates. It involves achieving rank through force, threats, intimidation, coercion. A dominant individual evokes fear and commands deference through aggression, explicit or implicit. But then there's the prestige strategy. This is thought to be a more uniquely human adaptation, linked to our complex culture and learning abilities. Prestige isn't taken by force, it's granted freely by others. It's afforded to individuals who demonstrate valuable skills, knowledge, expertise, or perhaps altruism and generosity. Others choose to defer to prestigious individuals because they want to learn from them or benefit from their skills or generosity. This strategy inspires respect, admiration, a desire to emulate.
Okay, dominance versus prestige. Two different ways to get ahead. So how does this dual strategy framework play into the big picture of the stratification engine we've been dissecting?
Well, the stratification engine, as we've analyzed it, fundamentally relies on dominance. It uses coercive power, economic power, ideological power to enforce the hierarchy. However, a system based purely on dominance is inherently unstable and inefficient. It requires constant, costly enforcement, and it breeds resentment, resistance. For a system of control to be truly stable and resilient over the long term, it needs to appear legitimate. It needs to secure the consent, or at least the acquiescence, of the governed. And this, according to the sources, is where things get really interesting, maybe even insidious. The most ingenious feature of the modern stratification engine is its remarkable ability to achieve stability by co-opting the psychology of prestige. The system uses its vast ideological power channeled through media, education, advertising, popular culture to subtly redefine what traits and outcomes are considered prestigious. It systematically frames the outward signs and symbols of dominance, especially extreme wealth, as if they were the natural rewards of prestige. So, for example, the dominant cultural narrative relentlessly pushes the idea that immense wealth is the direct, deserved result of prestigious qualities like exceptional hard work, brilliant innovation, unique skill, maybe visionary leadership. The billionaire gets culturally constructed not as a dominant accumulator of capital who might have benefited hugely from exploitative labor practices, favorable political connections, or just inherited wealth, but as a prestigious innovator, a visionary who earned their fortune purely through superior talent and effort. And this cultural sleight of hand, as the sources put it, is incredibly effective. Why? Because the majority of the population, psychologically wired by evolution to seek out and grant prestige to those with valuable skills, are manipulated into admiring, respecting, maybe even emulating the very figures and symbols that represent the dominant structure that constrains them. People are encouraged to participate enthusiastically in a system, believing it will reward their own prestigious efforts, even when the structure of that system makes such rewards statistically improbable for most. This, the sources argue, powerfully explains the enduring appeal and persistence of the myth of meritocracy. It's a far more efficient and durable form of social control than raw coercion because it enlists the population in its own subordination by appealing to one of our deepest social instincts.
Wow. Co-opting prestige. That's a really powerful and slightly chilling idea. Okay, this whole deep dive into systemic inequality, it naturally brings us to some fundamental philosophical questions about justice, doesn't it? How do we even begin to evaluate if this engine, or any social system for that matter, is fair?
Absolutely. And to address that fundamental question of fairness, we can turn to one of the most influential modern frameworks, John Rawls's theory of justice as fairness. Rawls was trying to find a principled way to reconcile these often competing values of liberty and equality. His theory gives us a really powerful ethical lens to look through. His core idea is this famous thought experiment, the original position behind a veil of ignorance. He asks us to imagine rational individuals coming together to choose the basic principles for their society. But here's the twist. They have to choose these principles without knowing any arbitrary facts about themselves. They don't know their race, their gender, their social class, their wealth, their natural talents or abilities, even their conception of what makes life good. By being ignorant of their own potential position in the society they're designing, Rawls argued, these rational individuals will be forced to choose principles that would be fair to everyone. For instance, they wouldn't agree to permit slavery because, hey, they might end up being a slave themselves once the veil is lifted. So Rawls argued that from this impartial original position, two fundamental principles of justice would logically emerge. First, the principle of equal basic liberties. Everyone must have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties. Things like political liberty, freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of conscience compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for everyone else. And crucially, this principle has absolute priority. You can't trade away basic liberties for economic gain. Second, the social and economic principle. This one has two parts. Social and economic inequalities are permissible only if they meet two conditions. A, they must be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. This is the famous difference principle. It's quite radical. It says inequality is only justified if it works to improve the condition of the people at the bottom. And B, these inequalities must be attached to offices and positions that are open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. This goes beyond just formal non-discrimination. It requires proactive measures like ensuring access to good education and healthcare so that people with similar talents and motivation have similar life chances, regardless of the social class they were born into. So if we step back and judge the existing stratification engine by this rigorous Rawlsian standard, well, the sources conclude it's profoundly unjust. It systematically disadvantages the majority, concentrates wealth and opportunity at the top, with often very little demonstrable benefit trickling down to the least advantaged.
That's a very clear standard. Now, let's pivot slightly and look at the technology itself. The very tools that allow us to measure these wearable feelings, they also raise some pretty profound ethical questions about surveillance, control. What does this tell us about our relationship with technology more broadly?
Yeah, the philosophy of technology really reminds us that technology is never just a neutral tool. It actively shapes our human experience, our emotions, or social relations. Marshall McLuhan famously said, "The medium is the message." And you can see that today. Think about the rise of emotion-sharing technologies, social media likes, emojis, reaction buttons. One source suggests these might inadvertently lead to a poorer, basic way of communicating our emotions, maybe pushing us towards a kind of technological emotional regime where nuanced feelings get flattened out. Now, the development of effective computing AI that can read and interpret human emotions raises even deeper ethical questions. While it has huge potential benefits, say in healthcare or education, the ability to monitor the wearable feelings of an entire population, well, while it could be a powerful diagnostic tool for social justice, as we've discussed, it could just as easily be used for invasive surveillance, manipulation, or social control. So the sources strongly emphasize that the development and deployment of these technologies must be guided by robust principles of responsible innovation. There needs to be a constant focus on the ethical implications, strong regulations to prevent misuse.
Makes sense. Okay, finally, let's talk about culture. If we think of the economic and power structures as the sort of hardware of this stratification engine, then what's the operating system? What's the software that dictates how it all actually runs on a day-to-day basis?
That operating system is culture. Culture is that complex whole fume. The shared beliefs, values, norms, symbols, languages, practices that shapes our social life. It provides the blueprint for how we perceive the world, how we interact with each other. And a key part of culture is social norms. These are the rules, often unspoken, that govern our behavior. They define what's considered normal, expected, acceptable within a group. You have formal norms, like laws, but also lots of informal norms, etiquette, customs. You have mores, which embody core moral views, like taboos against killing, and folkways, which are just conventions for everyday life, like how you greet someone. We generally conform to these norms because it provides comfort, predictability, and deviation, especially from the important mores, is often met with negative sanctions, from disapproval to punishment. This is how culture enforces social order. So this cultural framework provides a really powerful explanation for the stability of the stratification engine. The economic and power structures, the hardware of inequality, they can't function effectively without a compatible cultural software that directs people's behavior within those structures. This software consists of the norms, values, and beliefs that make the hierarchical arrangement seem natural, perhaps even just. For instance, think about a highly competitive capitalist economy, that's the hardware. It tends to run best, from the system's perspective, on a cultural operating system that glorifies individualism, material wealth as a sign of success, maybe consumerism as a primary source of identity and meaning. This cultural software encourages individuals to see themselves primarily as competitors in a race for resources and status. It channels desires towards acquiring things within the system rather than questioning the fairness of the system itself. And this helps ensure that the majority willingly participate in the very economic and social practices that tend to perpetuate their own stratification. This framework also helps explain cultural conflict. When different cultural operating systems, groups with very different values, beliefs, norms come into intense contact, especially under conditions of scarcity or power imbalance, conflict can easily arise. It can feel like a fundamental threat when core beliefs are challenged. Neuroscience even suggests our brains can react as if facing a physical threat, and misunderstandings get amplified by differences in communication styles. For example, high-context cultures rely a lot on shared background and nonverbal cues, while low-context cultures emphasize direct, explicit verbal communication. Imagine a direct, low-context statement landing as blunt or rude in a high-context setting, or a high-context hint being completely missed in a low-context one. So fostering cooperation across cultural divides requires real cultural fluency. It requires moving beyond the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated, towards the platinum rule, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Really understanding and respecting their values and communication styles. Ultimately, intense cultural conflict can sometimes be seen as a struggle for control over the societal hardware itself, each group trying to install its own dominant cultural software.
Okay, so we've really broken down this engine of stratification piece by piece. The physiology, the brain, the history, the power dynamics, the evolutionary psychology, the culture. It's incredibly complex. But if we want to change it, if we want a fairer society, you've hinted it's not as simple as just flipping a switch or pulling one single lever. Why do simple fixes so often seem to fail? And what does this complexity mean for finding a path forward?
Exactly. The core reason simple fixes often fail is because society is best understood not as a machine, but as a complex adaptive system. These systems are made up of numerous interacting agents, people, institutions, companies, etc., whose collective behavior gives rise to patterns and properties, like inequality, that you can't predict just by analyzing the individual parts in isolation. And several key concepts from complexity theory are really crucial for understanding this. First, emergence. Widespread social inequality usually isn't the result of some single, centrally designed master plan. Rather, it emerges from countless local interactions, decisions, and feedback loops within the system. Second, feedback loops. Complex systems are full of them, and the stratification engine is stabilized by incredibly powerful positive or reinforcing feedback loops. We talked about the wealth power loop. Wealth buys political influence, which creates policies that generate more wealth. These loops make the system highly resistant to change. It wants to stay in its current state. Third, path dependence. The history of a complex system matters profoundly. Initial conditions, historical events like colonialism, the way property rights were set up centuries ago, can create structures that effectively lock a society into a particular developmental path. Once you're on an unequal path, it's extremely difficult to divert because all the interconnected parts of the system have kind of co-evolved to support that trajectory. Fourth, Nonlinearity. In complex systems, cause and effect are often wildly disproportionate. You might make a huge policy intervention and see very little change. But sometimes, a small, well-targeted shift in just the right place, a critical node or leverage point, can trigger a cascade of transformation. The obvious solutions often aren't the most effective ones. And finally, sometimes systems can conflict in ways that create anti-resilience. Different systems within society, say, an unregulated market system pushing for pure profit, conflicting with public health system trying to ensure well-being, can actively undermine each other, making society less resilient and actually exacerbating inequality. So, applying this complex systems lens reveals this critical insight called policy resistance. Because complex adaptive systems are stabilized by these intricate webs of feedback loops, they have a natural tendency to counteract direct linear interventions. They try to maintain their equilibrium. This explains why so many well-intentioned anti-poverty programs or equality initiatives have failed or produced really disappointing results. For instance, you might give direct cash payments to low-income families, a seemingly straightforward fix, but the system might resist if landlords then raise rents or corporations increase prices for basic goods, effectively absorbing the benefit and leaving the fundamental structure of inequality unchanged.
Right, the system just pushes back. So treating inequality like a simple problem with a simple fix, it's basically doomed to fail because the system itself is designed almost to resist those simple fixes. Okay, so what does this profound complexity mean for leadership, for how we should select leaders, and what the purpose of governance should even be in such a complex world?
It means we need a fundamental shift in how we think about leadership and governance. The sources argue that a proper culture for selecting leaders in the 21st century must prioritize a whole new set of competencies derived directly from this systemic understanding. An effective and genuinely just leader in this complex world needs to be, first and foremost, a systems thinker. They need the cognitive ability to see society not as a collection of separate issues, but as an interconnected, complex, adaptive system. They need to understand nonlinearity, feedback loops, path dependence. Their goal shouldn't be to command and control the system, which is impossible anyway, but to identify and intervene strategically at key leverage points to gently shift the system's behavior towards more desirable, more just outcomes. Second, their actions must be guided by a theory of justice. They need a clear ethical framework, like Rawls' justice as fairness, demanding that policies and interventions be evaluated primarily based on their impact on the least advantaged members of society. Justice can't be an afterthought, it has to be the guiding principle. Third, and this is critical, they must be morally and ethically grounded. They need the character and integrity to resist the inevitably corrupting influence of concentrated power. Their motivation must be rooted in genuine public service, not personal enrichment or maintaining power for its own sake. And finally, they need to be deeply empathetic and compassionate. They need the ability to connect with the lived experience of all citizens, to understand those wearable feelings we talked about, the real physiological and emotional toll of insecurity, injustice, and lack of opportunity. They need to be genuinely motivated by a desire to alleviate suffering and promote human flourishing for everyone. So the ultimate purpose of this kind of deep scientific analysis, combining the wearable feelings data with the historical and systemic understanding, is precisely to equip such leaders, and perhaps more importantly, the informed citizenry that elects and holds them accountable. It aims to provide the diagnostic tools to see the problem's real impact, wearable feelings, the systemic model to understand its complex mechanics, complexity theory, and the ethical compass to navigate towards just solutions, like Rawls' justice as fairness.
That's a compelling vision for leadership. Okay, so finally, let's talk about the path forward. If simple fixes fail, what does a more systemic approach look like? This isn't the simple checklist you said, but more like a coordinated portfolio of interventions, targeting the stratification engine at multiple levels.
That's exactly right. It's not about finding one magic bullet. It's about strategically intervening across the system to weaken those negative feedback loops that perpetuate inequality and strengthen positive feedback loops that promote fairness, well-being, and opportunity. The sources outline a range of potential interventions grouped thematically. First, economic interventions aimed at altering the hardware of the economy. Things like deeply progressive taxation, especially targeting concentrated wealth and large inheritances, to counteract that wealth power feedback loop. Establishing universal access to high-quality foundational services, public education, comprehensive health care, affordable childcare, maybe even basic housing to create genuine fair equality of opportunity, as Rawls envisioned. Mandating living wages, not just minimum wages, so full-time work actually lifts people out of poverty. And promoting forms of widespread capital ownership, like employee stock ownership plans or community wealth funds, so more people have a stake in economic prosperity. Second, political and governance interventions focused on rewiring the connections between economic power and political decision-making. This includes things like radical campaign finance reform, maybe public financing of elections, strict limits on lobbying and private donations to break that direct link between wealth and political influence, significantly strengthening global anti-slavery enforcement, dramatically increasing resources and holding corporations accountable for forced labor anywhere in their supply chains, and adopting more adaptive governance models, thinking of policies more like experiments, using aggregated and anonymized wearable feelings data, perhaps, for real-time feedback on the actual physiological impacts of policies on different populations. Third, cultural and educational interventions aimed at updating the societal software. This means overhauling educational curricula at all levels to teach systems thinking, complexity science, and cultural fluency, giving future citizens the tools to understand these complex social problems. It also means intentionally fostering compassion, empathy, and justice-oriented values in education and public life, moving away from a culture of hyper-individualism and zero-sum competition towards one that values cooperation, collective well-being, and a shared commitment to justice. This might involve teaching perspective-taking skills and the neuroscience of empathy from a young age. And finally, technological interventions focused on building and deploying new tools ethically. This includes developing and deploying ethical emotion AI specifically for public good applications in public health, mental wellness support, maybe policy feedback, but with extremely strict regulations against manipulative advertising, predictive policing, or social scoring systems. It also involves building radical transparency platforms using technology to create open access databases that track money in politics, map complex corporate supply chains to expose labor abuses or environmental damage, and monitor regulatory compliance in real time.
Wow, that's a comprehensive portfolio. What's really fascinating wrapping this up is how this entire deep dive has revealed the profound interconnectedness of everything. Our individual physiological experience, our neurological function, the long shadow of historical exploitation, intricate power structures, cultural beliefs, even the technology we create. It's all woven together in shaping human inequality. We've really seen how the engine of stratification is wired deep into our biology, our choices, and the very fabric of our societies.
Absolutely. And it underscores that this is truly a long-term, complex endeavor. The goal isn't some unrealistic utopia of perfect equality, which might not even be desirable or possible. Rather, it's about building a fundamentally more just and balanced world. A world where every single individual has a fair opportunity, a genuine, substantive opportunity to live a healthy, dignified, and prosperous life, free from the crushing weight of systemic disadvantage.
So, thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening right now? Maybe consider this final thought. If our bodies really are, in some sense, the ultimate arbiters of a policy's human cost, if our brains are subtly shaped and wired by the environment we live in, what daily assumptions or choices might you start to re-examine? Assumptions about your own agency, maybe, within this incredibly complex system. How might understanding this engine, even just a little bit better, change how you interpret the world around you? And maybe, just maybe, what small leverage points might you identify in your own sphere of influence where you could subtly push back against these deep currents of stratification? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
This is DigitView.